All right, so good evening to all of you and welcome in the summer term, so to speak, and also to those of you who are outside in the World Wide Web. And of course, a particularly warm welcome to our special guest tonight, Corine PELLUCHON. We are really happy, very happy to have you here. It's an extraordinary event for us. Let me briefly introduce Corine PELLUCHON. She arrived in Erfurt today from Hamburg, where she is right now a fellow at the famous new institute, working there for a year or probably for 2 years. But apart from that, she is a professor in Paris at the Gustave Eiffel University there, where you are a regular professor and also a member of the laboratory working on the political on Hannah Arendt's politics, right? And but you know her from a number of books she has written, which were very successful, actually on a global scale. Really, I think it's no exaggeration to say that she is one of the very most important and famous contemporary philosophers writing right now in the world, with her books translated in many languages and also in German. But you started writing your dissertation on la critique des Lumières modernes chez Leo Strauss. I found this very interesting because when I was studying with Hannah Arendt and Leo, I did not study with them, but about them, right, in political theory. And one of the topics you have always worked on is enlightenment, right? Which is a topic which you followed through, right, to your writings of today. And then you did you wrote that at Sorbonne, and then you did a habilitation entitled Bioethics, Ecology et Philosophie politique, proposition pour un enrichissement de la philosophie du sujet. Über das, also es gibt es auch in Deutsch, nämlich unter Bioethik, Ökologie und politische Philosophie, Vorschläge zur Bereicherung der Philosophie des Subjekts. And I think this really kind of brings together the topics you stand for. You work on bioethics, but of course so on ethics and ecology, right? And coming up with a new form of virtue ethics, in fact. So there are a lot of prizes you got and a lot of things which I should mention, but I don't want to do this because I don't want to take up your time. I just want to mention that you received the Günther Anders Prize for Critical Thinking in February 2020 for your last book, which is also in German, Das Zeitalter des Lebendigen, eine neue Philosophie der Aufklärung, which was actually on the Zeitbestenliste on number 1, right, in recent times. And so it really became a bestseller and deserved that. But you might also know a number of other books which Corine PELLUCHON has written and which are also available in German. For example, the Manifest für die Tiere in 2020, die Ethik der Wertschätzungen, Tugend für eine ungewisse Welt und das Buch über Ernährung, Nourishment. No, I think I started to talk in German because the books were in German, right? So you've written a very important and interesting books on nourishment and a philosophy of nourishment and the environment. But now I really want to stop because we want to listen to you and not to me. And the title of today's lecture is Ecology, Universalism and Emancipation, the Case for a New Enlightenment. Please, Corine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I will introduce my speech. I will state the general project of this book, which was published in January, Enlightenment in the Age of the Living. It will be the English translation. And I would like to indicate the challenge I have sought to take up, how to defend the Enlightenment in the current ecological, technological, and political context when its project of individual and collective emancipation is under attacks from all sides, from the right as well as from the left. How can the Enlightenment be defended after the tragedies of the 20th century, after Auschwitz, after Hiroshima, after the colonial crimes that lead to the suspicion that all universalism is imperialist? Not to mention the ecological, sanitary, and economic counterproductivity of our development model. And why do we need to defend enlightenment, especially when we advocate radical change, which is my case, in a way of understanding or inhabiting the earth and interacting with animals? A lot of people who advocate animal rights and so on do reject enlightenment. So why do I need to defend the project of enlightenment? I have 5 points. In the first one, I will distinguish the anti-enlightenment from the criticism coming from postmodernism, from feminist and post-colonial studies. In a second point, I will introduce the resources I use to promote a non-hegemonistic rationalism and a new enlightenment. In the third point, I will say why we need to defend enlightenment while acknowledging that a lot of events and epistemological changes separate us from the past enlightenment. So this new enlightenment is really new. There's a break between the past enlightenment and the kind of enlightenment I want to promote and which comes after the collapse of the Enlightenment. In the fourth point, I will quickly establish my diagnosis by making a kind of genealogy of nihilism, aiming to explain the inversion of progress into regression, for which the Enlightenment of the 18th century is not responsible, but from which it has not preserved us. I will speak of a double amputation of reason that goes back to the instrumental rationalism manifested in modernity, but also I will speak of a more original separation between reason and nature, this dualism between nature and culture, animals and humans, for me is a kind of vice of all civilization, and it's common to the Enlightenment and the anti-Enlightenment. I think that the new Enlightenment aims at eradicating it. I will introduce the two main concepts of this book, the notion of scheme and the notion of, excuse me for the jargon, civilizational epoche. Of course, I will translate it, I will explain. And in the last point, I will try to find out why the new enlightenment is ecological and what is the emancipatory force of ecology, and why does it require a decentering of democracy. And I will conclude by a few words on hope, which is not a psychological trait. So, first point, I will try to define enlightenment. What is enlightenment? Well, enlightenment. The enlightenment refers less to a century or a continent than to an attitude. Michel Foucault spoke of an ethos. And the ethos, the attitude which characterizes enlightenment, is a critical relationship with the present. This reflexivity makes it possible to become aware of the challenges of the present, of the challenges to be met in order to renew the link between theory and practice. So the idea that the future is not fixed and that it depends on the way in which meaning is established by freeing oneself from outdated representations testifies to the importance of freedom of thought and autonomy. But this means that enlightenment is an unfinished or ongoing process by which, in every age and on several continents, some human beings try to affirm, to claim the value of freedom and to provide some guidelines for social changes, while identifying the challenges, the representations and practices to change, and acknowledging also the obstacles and the dangers. The Enlightenment has a positive content, but it is also defined by what it fights against. So this ideal of both individual and collective emancipation explains why the Enlightenment is always associated with the project of society that bases social and political organization on the autonomy of subjects and not on a hierarchical or theocratic order. The importance of freedom of thought goes hand in hand with the recognition of the moral equality of persons. This is things that, of course, you know very well, but you will see that it could be jeopardized. So it is, enlightenment is always associated with a project of establishing a society based on this moral equality of persons. And so the first two pillars of the Enlightenment is autonomy, democracy, and it goes hand in hand with the conviction that humanity is one, which was, of course, embodied in the philosophy of human rights. It is the third pillar of the Enlightenment, and it is the Enlightenment is always connected with the affirmation of the importance of rationality, of reason as a means to access to universalizable principles. These principles enable us to build a society on what we have in common and to free ourselves from superstitions and fanatism and so forth. So these four pillars are opposed point by the anti-enlightenment, which defends a contrary project of society based on a hierarchical order founded on tradition and on an essentialism that justifies the subjugation of certain beings by others and even acknowledges racism. The anti-enlightenment rejects equality, restricts the individual to his or her ethnic or biological affiliation, and conducts identity policies that are contrary to the pluralism that constitutes democracy. It contends for human rights, feeds its nationalism, and the anti-enlightenment also believes that particular communities are incompatible. Finally, the anti-enlightenment displays a contempt for reason that feeds the rejection of mediation, that is, traditional channels of knowledge and representative institutions. And this, of course, benefits conspiracy and populism. But to say that, you know, of course, means that enlightenment and anti-enlightenment are intellectual structures. I focus less on the historical forms than on the intellectual structures they stand for. Of course, they are characterized by some traits we find in the diverse form they take over time. And this is the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment is also criticized, especially nowadays, on the left, by the postmodernists. However, the postmodernists, that is to say feminist, post-colonial studies, have nothing to do with anti-enlightenment. They rightly accuse the post-enlightenment of being hegemonic and blind to differences. However, their criticism that aims to denounce the violence of Enlightenment rationalism does not lead to the rejection of the Enlightenment project of establishing an inclusive society. On the contrary, it is on behalf of the Enlightenment ideals of freedom, equality, justice that feminists and post-colonial studies denounce the false universalism of the past Enlightenment, a universalism that was a way of imposing a partial point of view by hiding itself behind supposedly general principles. So the criticism of the postmodernists must be taken seriously. However, it is not because past humanism is based, as Claude Lévi-Strauss said, on an arrogant anthropocentrism, and that the universalism of the past Enlightenment is false or blind to difference, that we must abandon any universalizable ideal. Because if we throw all universalist ideals overboard, we will never be able to build a common project and fight against global warming, the scourges of economism, the drifts of technology, the rise of nationalism. And to do that, we need universalizable reference points, but of course we cannot find them in the past, in the tradition, and the past Enlightenment. I will say why. So it's necessary to think about what we have in common instead of focusing on what sets us apart. And relativism and everything that weakens Enlightenment benefits the anti-Enlightenment. So second point, you will ask me, how do I pretend to build a universalism which is not overbearing, not hegemonic or blind to difference? What is my tool? What are my tools? Just an answer. Well, I borrow from phenomenology, excuse me, and especially from a phenomenology of corporeality, my tools. And I will especially speak of Merleau-Ponty and its concept of contextual lateral universalism in a text he wrote for Lévi-Strauss and Mauss. Well, phenomenology, I don't know whether you know very well, but I will just explain in a couple of sentences. Phenomenology is a philosophical approach born at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a method and an experience which allows us to apprehend the phenomena, reality, by avoiding two dead ends. So first dead end is a naive objectivism on the one hand, and the second dead end is relativism on the other end. Objectivism consists in thinking that all thoughts are the copy of the reality, that all scientific theories reach things in themselves, and for the phenomenologists, the real is always apprehended by a consciousness which aims at it and determines it, draws its contours in an always partial but unfinished way. So there is no more an object on the one hand and a subject on the other hand. Phenomenology, whose major concept is that of intentionality, describes the way in which things are given to us or not. An example, you can constitute the table, but you cannot constitute the others, which led Levinas to speak of the other's face. You cannot define the other. He always escapes the concept of humanity. This is why he's so unique, that you cannot, it's your power to constitute the other human being is a failure. And this failure, the way that the other is not given to my consciousness, reveals the meaning of my relation to the other. My relation to the other is not a relation based on power or on consciousness or knowledge, is a dimension which Levinas calls ethics. That is to say that the other sets limits to my right to use whatever I please, because he sets limit first to my power to constitute him, to grasp him. I can't grasp the other. So the ways of phenomenology has two main operations. The first one is epoche, to put into bracket natural attitude. So natural attitude is the fact that we all have glasses which make us see the world in a certain way, and we believe that what we see is reality. We don't know that we have glasses. That is to say that we have beliefs, but we don't know that they are beliefs. So phenomenology starts with this doubt, which Husserl says it is epoche, suspension of the natural attitude. And the second operation is the return to the acts of consciousness in which things are given to me or not. That is to say, the way things are given to me reveals their meaning. So, and why it is so important for Levinas, for ethics, and for Merleau-Ponty, and so forth, because it reveals sensitive layers of reality and insists on the heterogeneity of the access to the real. And for instance, Merleau-Ponty, in the mid-40s, when existentialism in Sartre was a way of describing human existence, Merleau-Ponty says animals too are other existence. Why? Because they have an intentionality. They can mettre en forme le monde. They can build on the world. They can. It's the way they set in form the world. So there is a multiplicity of ways of inform the world. So doing phenomenology implies enriching your perception of the world by making possible the multiplicity of perspective on the same world. There is one world, but of course we have different perspectives. And if you have read Leibniz, you have an image which is very interesting and which is for me the image of enlightenment. That is to say that there is one town, one city which is seen from different perspectives. It is no longer an overbearing reason which interpret the world with a top-down approach, but it's a way of seeing the world in a with different perspectives, and this drove Merleau-Ponty into speaking of a lateral universalism, because you can change your perspective. So, but it's not relativism. Why? Because phenomenology, especially the phenomenology I have developed after Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, and so forth, a phenomenology which focuses on phenomena which escape my will, my power of constitution, these phenomena which stress my passivity, tiredness, the fact that I eat, the fact that I inhabit the world, and the description, the phenomenological description of my way of eating, dwelling, Atman, breathing, and so forth, this phenomena shed light on human condition. I do not speak of human nature, but of human condition. That is to say that even if a lot of things in our existence are socially constructed, we all have a body, we all need to eat, we all breathe. And when we are eating, we always have an impact upon the others, be they human and non-humans. That is to say that the phenomenological description of our embodiment of our corporeality shed lights on human condition, and it learns, we understand that human being is not only understood in light of freedom, understood the capacity to make choices and to change them, but the receptivity, the passivity, and also the pleasure we have in eating and so forth, and the relational dimension of our existence are all important. And we have, with phenomenology and with this phenomenology of corporeality, some universalizable benchmarks which can change everything. Because if we understand the foundations of political theory, of modern and contemporary political theory, we understand that the foundations of this theory in Hobbes to Rawls is the atomistic subject understood in light of freedom, understood as a capacity to make choices and to change them. But if we grant a political theory upon a subject which is eating, whose materiality of existence is very important and taken seriously, then we understand the inhabitation of the world and the protection of the finite biosphere, the justice toward other beings, other animals, enter politics. And they do not enter politics because I want them to enter politics, but they enter politics because they belong to us. So the phenomenological description, they provide very important guidelines for a contextualized universalism. So I propose to rethink the Enlightenment by introducing this lateral and contextual universalism, welcoming the diversity of life forms and culture. But why, for point 3, why do I need to, why do I want to renew Enlightenment? Why do I refer to this tradition that many ecological thinkers and animal activists reject? How do I dare to speak of Enlightenment after Auschwitz, Hiroshima, in the context of today's technoscience, where the world progress is difficult to say? And while you can't stop thinking of the daily massacre of animals worldwide. So are there some historical and epistemological breaks between this new Enlightenment and the Enlightenment of Kant, Descartes, and the like? Well, first, the Enlightenment project must be defended because it is under attack by the anti-Enlightenment which has some faces, for instance, Marine Le Pen. Today, you know. But so, and this attack has concrete manifestation, the awakeness of nationalism, xenophobia, the theocratic temptation, but also transhumanism. Of course, people say transhumanism, it is an heritage of Enlightenment. No, because if you understand the four pillars, autonomy, where transhumanism means that the future is fixed and does no longer need us. And you can see with the myth of the singularity, individual is riveted to his technological equipment, which replaces the essentialism of yesteryear. Transhumanism does not foster democratic society, but a hierarchical order, and it illustrates the reversal of rationality into mythology. So it presents itself as an heir of the Enlightenment, but in fact it is a new form of anti-Enlightenment. But why do we need to defend Enlightenment? Because its pillars still make sense. However, it's important to reconfigure the main categories of Enlightenment. Autonomy can no longer be reduced to self-determination. It has to be understood in light of our vulnerability, of passivity, and in light of the responsibility we have toward other beings. To the other beings whose life is intertwined with our life. And not to mention the fact that the structure of our responsibility has changed, because as Günther Anders said, we can inflict damage or problems to other peoples. Also, we do